Thank you so much. That's a wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. This promises to be a fascinating conversation. We're going to be talking about U Thant, who was essentially a Buddhist school teacher in colonial Burma. And back then it was British India, and his rise to become the UN Secretary General. Before we start getting into the nitty-gritties of his career, though, I do want to begin by asking U Thant about his rise. You know, this was a man who came from a small town in Burma. He finds himself in the halls of the United Nations. Tell us a little bit about how he got there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. I'm really pleased to be here, pleased to be back in Jaipur after a few years. This wasn't a book that I had intended to write. I mean, I lived with my grandfather until I was 8 years old and he passed away. And I knew broadly the outlines of his life and what he had done at the UN. But the past few years, not only have I been really immersed in the 1960s and his time at the UN, but thinking a lot about this early life, the backstory to before he was Secretary General as well. And as you suggest, I mean, he was born in 1909. He was born in a small town, very small town, wooden houses, wooden buildings in the Irrawaddy Delta. Then it was about a day's steamer ride away from Rangoon, which was the capital. And of course, Burma in those days was part of British India, a province of British India, the same as the Punjab or Bengal. And he was born to a well-to-do landowning family that suddenly became impoverished when he was 15 years old. His father died, and a rival branch of the family took all the money, all the land. And he, at age 15, decided that he wouldn't finish university, that instead he would go for 2 years, come back, be a school teacher, and be able to provide for his mother and his 3 younger brothers. So he gave up his ambitions to join the Indian civil service and became a school teacher until he was 40 years old. And it was when he was 40 that he had maybe not a midlife crisis, but a desire for midlife career change. And he left that very small town in 1948. And within 9 years, he was living in Midtown Manhattan as Burma's ambassador to the UN.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah. I want to come back to his roots, which were in colonial Burma. He becomes the first Asian Secretary General of the United Nations in 1961. It's a point at which decolonization has overtaken the world, Africa and Asia coming into their own. What does he bring as part of his identity to his understanding of how the United Nations should work in a time like this?
I think that, so he arrives in New York in 1957. It's still a fairly segregated city. He has trouble even finding an apartment for him and his family, which included my mother, who was 18 at the time. But this was the age of decolonization, and he was part of a wave of diplomats, people from newly decolonized, newly independent Asian and African nations that were coming into international politics and really reshaping the UN. And I would just take a step back maybe and say that, in the West, in the UK where I live, or in the US, we tend to think of 20th century history as a history of 2 world wars, then a Cold War, then the post-Cold War American unilateral period, and then whatever period we're in now. But for most of the world, Burma and India included, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and post-empire. And it was in the 1950s that this wave of decolonization was gathering steam. These countries met in Bandung. And I think we have to really appreciate this, they transformed what had been Franklin Roosevelt's UN project into something very different.
He was the secretary also of the Bandung Conference.
He was the secretary of the Bandung Conference, and he brought to New York, with many other men and women as well, the ideas of Bandung, which was basically that, that the world, there was no reason after empire, after the great struggles against empire for many decades, that we couldn't now live in a peaceful world based on sovereign equality. And they embraced the UN, they embraced the UN Charter, and they really made it their home. So he was part of that. And within a few years in New York as ambassador, he developed a reputation as the man who got along with everyone, both his third world colleagues, but also people from the North, from Europe, from the Soviet Union, from America as well.
I want to move us to the main crises that he dealt with throughout the decade that he was there. And I'd like to kick us off with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think your book brings out magnificently, was actually a real mirror into how he handled a crisis like this, his style of diplomacy, his temperament as a leader in his own right. He was at that point possibly the only thing that Kennedy and Khrushchev could agree with at that point. And you also have these wonderful vignettes about Fidel Castro. Talk us through the Cuban Missile Crisis and talk us through U Thant's role there, because I didn't know anything about this when I first picked up your book.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, just a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, the UN itself was in deep crisis, a little bit like now. It was in a funding crisis. The then Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld had just been killed in a mysterious plane crash we now know is almost certainly involving foul play. And U Thant became the only human being in the world that East and West, North and South could agree on. But the Russians would only allow him to be acting Secretary General because they didn't know him very well. And so he took on the job. He was very focused on the Congo, which was the great crisis of the day. And in order to outflank the Europeans, the British in particular, but the others as well, on the Congo crisis, where he really wanted a tough line against the Katanga secession, he developed a very close relationship with John F. Kennedy. They met several times. And then he flew to the Black Sea to meet with Khrushchev, and they spent a day together, even swimming off the coast of Crimea. And then what was very serendipitous for the world was that just weeks later, the Cuban Missile Crisis kicks off, and he already had a good working relationship and even personal relationship with the two of the three protagonists in the conflict. I mean, there's an enormous amount to say about those pivotal few weeks, but the main thing I would say, or maybe two or three things that I would say, first is that I think most of you know the broad outlines of the conflict. The Soviets had put missiles in Cuba. Kennedy then established a blockade of Cuba. Soviet ships were approaching the blockade line, and over a couple of days, it looked like the world was on the brink of a possible nuclear war. And U Thant, that night that Kennedy went on television and said this to the world, he felt immediately that he had to intervene. He had the Security Council he knew was going to be deadlocked. Then as it has been in the many decades since on many different crises and issues. But he felt even without any mandate, he had to intervene as the Secretary General of the UN. And he did this explicitly as the Secretary General of the UN from an Afro-Asian country, from a non-aligned country. And the non-aligned countries at that time really felt, even long before the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was their responsibility, countries like Burma and India, to save the North. The Russians, the Americans, who left to their own devices, would blow themselves up sooner rather than later. And he worked very closely with his top two aides, who were both Indian, as well as others from the non-aligned movement. And he sent a series of both private and public messages to both Moscow and Washington, Kennedy and Khrushchev, with the aim of intervening in a way that would provide both men the time and the space to take a step back. So he knew that at the end of the day, this wasn't a military crisis, but a political crisis, and that what both men needed was that breathing space for dialogue and diplomacy. So he did that. The second thing that he did was he understood, as someone from a small country, that in the middle of this was another small country, Cuba, which couldn't be forgotten. And as Kennedy and Khrushchev came closer to an agreement, Fidel Castro was livid that this was being done above his head. So U Thant, on October 30th, 1962, flew down to Havana. Castro was incandescent with rage. And then U Thant said, let's tomorrow just meet. I'll be alone. I won't bring any of my aides. He consciously went with just men from the third world as his top aides, and Castro agreed. And in that meeting, he said to Fidel Castro, look, you're from a small country, I'm from a small country. You have every right to have foreign missiles, foreign bases, enter into foreign military alliances. But I'm trying to paint you the bigger picture. The world is on the brink of a nuclear war, and we all need to take a deep breath and take a step back. And Castro accepted that. And the next day he went on Cuban television and said, U Thant showed us respect. And that allowed him also to be a neutral point of reference for the Cubans as well, as they tried to make their way through the processes that would come afterwards. So again, much more to say, but the main thing I think is that he was able to insert himself as this neutral arbiter between these three players in a way that would diffuse the crisis. And also, I would say that it wasn't just him alone and his skill in diplomacy, but the fact that he represented this Bandung generation, this non-aligned movement that really wanted to make sure that they play this, not just this passive role, but a really active role in preventing nuclear war at the time.
And I think another thing to sort of remember, because I think your book brings this out really well, is the fact that you might think that the UN was paralyzed at that point, but the Secretary General wasn't. He was still somebody who had executive and moral authority, and U Thant wasn't afraid to be active in that role.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, as most of you know, the UN was formed in 1945. And the original idea was that it would be a continuation of the wartime alliance. So the British, the Russians, the Americans in particular, it would be this muscular collective security mechanism that would police the world. But even by the time of San Francisco, when the charter was signed, it was kind of clear that that wasn't really going to work out as intended. As the Cold War unfolded, it meant that the Soviets and the Americans were not working together. So over the late 40s and early 50s, that conception of the UN died away. But by the late 50s and early 60s, under Hammarskjöld and then U Thant, with this Afro-Asian wave coming into the UN, this idea that the Secretary General of the UN could also be the world's preeminent diplomat and diffuser of tensions, not just became an idea, but really successful for a while.
I want to come next to Vietnam, because U Thant was extremely critical of the Vietnam War. He saw it as this aggressive Cold War domino. So I want to ask two questions. One, how did his own identity play into his perception of that war? Two, was there anything that could have been done early on in the 1960s to salvage the situation? And what did he see the UN's role in Vietnam as being?
Yeah, I think we sometimes forget how central Vietnam really was to everything in the 1960s. And you know, if we go back to 1964, the Cuban Missile Crisis had happened a couple of years before. He had successfully, with the very active and strong help of the Indian government, which sent its best military units to the Congo, defeated the white supremacist insurrection in the Congo. He felt with Kennedy that he had someone that he could work with. He felt that Khrushchev also had changed, and he could work with the Soviets as well. And he didn't see any reason why the UN shouldn't go from strength to strength and begin to work not just on peace, but issues like international development as well. And then Vietnam got in the way. And I think he understood from 1963, 1964, that if the Americans went to war in Vietnam, that would be a disaster not just for the Vietnamese people, not just for America and its prestige around the world, but for the UN as well. And he said to the Americans, again, as early as 1964, he said, if you go to war in Vietnam, you will lose. He said, for these people, this is not about communism, first and foremost. They have no desire to be under the Chinese or the Russians or anyone else. This is a fight for their freedom and their independence. And he said, what you need really is a face-saving way in which America can disengage from Southeast Asia with its prestige intact. And this is what he offered to the Americans. But this was so far from what Johnson's White House in 1964 was thinking, which is that if we just begin to bomb North Vietnam, within a few months they will crack and come to the negotiating table, and the US will be able to impose terms. And so what began as a discreet intervention, an attempt at quiet diplomacy, he gained from Ho Chi Minh an agreement in the summer of 1964 to meet secretly with the Americans in Rangoon, was followed by many years of attempted and unsuccessful secret diplomacy. But then he discovered a different role for the UN Secretary General, which was that when his diplomacy was unsuccessful, he began to publicly challenge the American position on Vietnam. And not just challenge their position in terms of what they were doing, but challenge the Americans in their analysis of what the war was all about. And saying again, from the perspective, especially of someone from Burma, that this was much more about Vietnamese identity and nationalism, and not about the domino theory and the threat from the Soviets or the Chinese or anyone else. And this meant that for Washington, the UN went from being an instrument of their foreign policy and the UN Secretary Generalship to becoming a real potential political problem. And so that falling out between New York and Washington, between the UN and the Americans, really began in 1965, 66 over Vietnam.
And next, I want to come to the Middle East, because these are all massive crises, to sort of summarize in the short time that we have, in which U Thant played this incredibly pivotal role. He next played a very key and very difficult, I'd like to say, role in the Middle East with the Six-Day War between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, when Israel, comes in and occupies Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, sort of sets the stage for Yom Kippur in 1973. I had a couple of questions here, because so much of it is still so shockingly relevant in 2025, 26. When you're looking back across the archives, when you're looking back at U Thant's role here, I'd like you to first set the stage somewhat for what he actually did. And then I'd like you to sort of answer, if you could, as a historian, when you look back through the archives and you assess his role, what was the fallout of that role? Do you think it's had, what are the implications of it? Do you feel he was, made a scapegoat in some sense of the word? Do you feel his actions sort of set up the stage for further conflict?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's difficult to summarize in just a few minutes, but let me just say that, in 67, in the beginning of 67, he was still almost 100% focused on trying to end the war in Vietnam and becoming this irritant to the Johnson White House, which was also looking for ways, I think, to weaken his standing. He was then voted in a Gallup poll, not voted, but in a Gallup poll found that he was the fifth or sixth most admired man in America, ahead of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, and just behind Martin Luther King. So even though he's forgotten today, then he was still seen as a political force, even within American politics. And then the Six-Day War happened. He hadn't focused on the Middle East at all. And for those of you who may not know, I mean, the Six-Day War broke out because Nasser had moved well, we can look at it in different kinds of contexts, but there was increasing tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors, especially with Syria. Nasser moved tens of thousands of regular Egyptian troops into the Sinai. They went beyond where the UN peacekeepers, which had been deployed after the Suez crisis, had been deployed. So there were 2,000 troops along a very long front line from Gaza all the way to Sharm el-Sheikh. And on the 18th, 17th night of May 1967, U Thant was indirectly, through his Indian military commander in Sinai and Gaza, General Inderjit Ricky, was asked to remove the UN peacekeepers because the Egyptian troops were coming to the front line right up to the Israeli border. And so for U Thant, this was a matter of two things. One was Egyptian sovereignty, that Egypt had the right to, as a sovereign state, to move its troops anywhere it wanted and to request the removal of these peacekeepers, in the same way that Israel had refused to accept peacekeepers on its side of the border. So he felt, and he asked for legal advice and everything else, that he had to agree to this. But at the same time, he knew that what was at stake was a potential and disastrous Middle East war. So he wanted to play for time. So he flew to Cairo. And again, to make a very complicated story short, he managed to get from Nasser an agreement that the Egyptians would not be the first to attack, an agreement that they would accept UN mediation, an agreement to suspend their blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which Israel was saying was a cause for potential war. What he didn't know at the time, and what we know now from declassified records, is that the Americans had already, by the time he was in Cairo, green-lighted Israel's plans to attack first. And so Israel did. And again, a lot happened over the following days, but he was blamed for the war. It was even called U Thant's War in different American and British newspapers and magazines at the time. But I think if you look at what actually happened, I think there were ways in which maybe he could have done things differently, and we can talk about that if people are interested. But at the end of the day, Israel was, by the third week of May 1967, prepared for war. And I think it was very useful to say that it was because of the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers that they had to go to war, rather than this already being seen as a potential victory for Israel in terms of its expansion into Gaza and Sinai. But it was disastrous in terms of the UN standing publicly in both the US and the UK. And it began to damage even the work that he was trying to do on Vietnam at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely going to ask you, when you're looking back, do you feel, because we've discussed the Middle East, we've discussed the Cuban Missile Crisis, we've discussed Vietnam, do you feel at any point in any of these conflicts, especially in the Middle East, that he could have done things differently? I mean, I know retrospect is a beautiful thing, and you're looking back across the archives, and so much of what has happened across the years today makes a hideous kind of sense now. But in the moment, things are happening very fast, it's split second almost. Do you feel he could have made it?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot, because if we think about the situation over the past few years, I mean, it was the Six-Day War that created the map that we've had, right? With Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Sinai for a long time as well. So I was really keen to try to understand to what extent U Thant, my grandfather, was responsible for that war, as was alleged in many different secondary sources since. I think there were specific things, again, not to get into too much of the detail. I think that he had planned to write a formal appeal to Nasser very early on, like the appeal that he made to Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he didn't send that on the advice of one of his deputies. I think he should have sent that. He went to Cairo and had a long set of conversations with Nasser and other Egyptian officials. I think he should have then gone on to Tel Aviv to meet with Prime Minister Eshkol, who I think did not want war at that time. But at the end of the day, he wasn't able to come up with that very creative set of interventions that allowed him to be so successful, for instance, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think the bigger story, in a way, is that not only did this reshape the map of the Middle East, but it created this kind of straw man. This idea that it wasn't a war of Israeli aggression, but it was this miscalculation on the part of the UN that provoked Israel and made it inevitable that Israel would have to attack. And if you look at even more recent writing, oftentimes people will say, well, Israel obviously cannot trust the UN because of what happened in 1967. Over the following few years, the Middle East began to occupy a bigger and bigger part of his work, together with Vietnam and other crises then. And one thing that I didn't really appreciate until I was researching this book was the extent to which, by 1971, there had been the outlines of a peace plan that had been ironed out, with the initial support of Richard Nixon's administration, which would have seen the withdrawal of Israel from the West Bank, from Gaza, from the Sinai, in return for ironclad security guarantees and the deployment of maybe 30 or 40,000 Security Council mandated troops, including Soviet and American troops, to protect Israel. And that was something that was agreed by the different sides, but I think was ultimately undermined by Henry Kissinger in early 1971.
And when we're talking about researching your book, this was your grandfather you were writing about. I'd like to talk a bit about the process of that, because in one sense, it's researching the familiar, because you knew your grandfather, you knew his schedule, you knew what he liked to eat. So that brings a sort of intimacy to what you're writing. But how do you balance the familiarity with distance and rigor?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I was reluctant to write, or reluctance may be too strong a word, but I hesitated in writing the book because of exactly that. I wasn't sure how I would be objective, what that actually would mean. In a way, I was helped by the fact that, almost everything that I write in the book, 95% plus, are from the UN archives. And I should just say that, when he died, my parents, who were living with him at the time, gave everything in his study to the UN, his papers. And so that included everything from hotel receipts to medical records to his children's school reports to birthday cards to everything. And that, together with his official papers, all his notes, everything, was digitized over the past 5, 6, 7 years. And my entire book, almost, a lot of my book was based on those archives, as well as what's in the US, UK, and other national security archives. So it wasn't from my own memory. So in that way, I think it was based on evidence as opposed to memory. So I think that made a difference. Of course, where I depended to some extent on my personal memory, but also on interviews with people like my mother who's still alive and remembers a lot from that time, is his home life. And maybe one thing I should mention is that he was someone who he was very much an extrovert. And when he lived in that little town in Burma, my mother said that he and my grandmother often liked, after dinner, say at 6 o'clock, to take a walk down this dirt road, just as an after-dinner walk. But they never got beyond the third house because he just liked to stop and chat with all the neighbors and catch up. And I think in that very small town way, he also liked to host things. And he took that exact instinct with him to New York. So both as ambassador, also as Secretary General, every day he had these luncheons for visiting heads of state and government and foreign ministers, and friends like Jackie Kennedy, who became very good friends of his, who came to these lunches, and other celebrities as well. But every day at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock when he was done, he would go home to a nice home-cooked meal of rice and curry, and then he would watch TV. And I know that one of the things that he watched on TV a lot was the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night, for some of you who might know. So from that, I can also tell the music that he would have listened to, from Tom Jones and the Beatles all the way through the rock and roll of the early 1970s. And in some ways, I think by the early 1970s, he had become a kind of New Yorker as well, and very much immersed in that enormous cultural change that was taking place in America at that time.
Yeah, and you've opened your book also with U Thant's farewell lunch, right? And you have, the who's who of everyone there. But you also have John Lennon and Yoko Ono coming in. And John Lennon plays Imagine for the first time. This is a time when the Vietnam War is still on, and in fact, it's at its peak. There's this moment of almost hope in that introduction of yours. But when I'm thinking about U Thant and I'm thinking about what he left behind, how do you assess his career? Do you feel like it was a tragedy, a triumph?
Yeah, so I mean, I really struggled with this at the end. I mean, not at the end, but after the first couple of years of researching this book, of trying to think, is this a tragic story, where he goes from this small town to New York, becomes Secretary General, de-escalates the Cuban Missile Crisis, does all these things, but then at the end, the UN becomes less relevant. Washington turns away from it. But one of my friends who was at Bandung actually in 1955 said to me, "Who cares what the Americans think? It's not just an American story." And from the point of view of the rest of the world, 1970, 1971 was still that moment of the consolidation of the post-empire system. And through a whole series of other interventions, the UN had become relevant to the global majority by that time. And so I think it was, in some ways, a moment of triumph. And he was interviewed after that farewell luncheon. And he was asked almost exactly this question. And he said, "Look, when I was a young man living in Burma, I would have never thought that within 25 years, my country would become independent, and we would be sitting here at the same top table as the Americans, the British, and the French, sending off peacekeeping missions, holding conferences on outer space exploration. And if we can achieve this in 25 years, imagine what we can achieve in another 25 years." So I think for him and many of that Bandung generation, that was still a moment of triumph in many ways.
Yeah, and so when readers finally put this book down, what do you want them to remember? Because this was a man who did so many things differently, exerted the importance of moral authority over military might at many points in his public career. There's almost this pervasive sense of frustration, and there was in the 1960s as well, with the United Nations as an institution. So many questions about its relevance, so many questions about what it can do or what it should be doing, and it isn't. What do you want readers to remember when they put books like a biography of your grandfather down?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a couple of things. I mean, one is that the UN as an institution has evolved, changed, morphed into many different forms. And institutionally, it's always been dysfunctional to different ways. But when it's really worked, I mean, the times when the UN has been able to spread its wings and be effective is actually often in times of crisis like this, when it feels like we're in between different world orders, where there's crisis between the biggest powers. No one really knows what the future of the world is going to be. And that's when, under creative leadership, the UN is able to find some space. And there, I think it's not just the institutions like the Security Council, but individuals have made a huge difference. I think the second is, again, to emphasize the extent to which the UN is, yes, to some extent, a creation of the big powers at the end of the war, but it's really countries like India, like Burma, like Egypt, like Indonesia, like Ghana, that completely transformed it in the late 1950s and made it their own and made it successful at that time. I think with U Thant's story, it's to some extent, I mean, it's a story to some extent of a mid-career change that worked out very well. But I think it's also the story of someone who really valued relationships, really valued a certain type of diplomacy, but I think also put specific principles around the UN Charter first and foremost, and was until the end. I mean, in a way, in 1972, when he finally left the UN, he was almost, from that Bandung time, the last man standing, you know? If you think of all the leaders from the late 50s, from Sukarno to Nehru to Nkrumah to Nasser, they were all gone. And because of the Cold War and because of US policies, many had been forced to choose. And many, like Castro or Ho Chi Minh, were deemed enemies and communists. Others had been killed. Military coups had overthrown many others. But that moderate Bandung leadership of a certain type of democratic future for the Third World that seemed so possible in the 50s, he was almost the final voice of that in some ways by the early 70s.
Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation, but I'd like to open it up to the audience now. We have many questions. So we start from the front, and then we'll come to you. And there's a gentleman there.
Yeah, wonderful session, sir. But I have a question for you. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often painted as a success for John F. Kennedy. But I believe the internet is full of it. I really do not know what the truth is. So I believe it was a swap between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy for the Turkey Missile Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is the truth here, really?
What is the...
The Americans had put missiles in Turkey, and they were made to pull it out by Nikita Khrushchev because he put the missiles in Cuba.
So I mean, the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis was, of course, growing tensions between the Soviet Union and America. And the focus of those tensions was Berlin, and everyone expected or thought that there could be a rapid escalation of the Cold War tensions and possibly war because of the situation in Berlin in 1961, 1962. The Americans, as part of that, had deployed medium-range missiles in Turkey. And for Khrushchev, it was partly as a counter to that, but also to protect what he saw as the revolution in Cuba that was underway, and to protect Fidel Castro, whom he had met. He wanted to deploy missiles in Cuba. He thought that this would be a way in which not only to protect Cuba, but also to get back at the Americans for placing medium-range missiles in Turkey at the time. And during the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was not only an agreement, well, basically, let me take a step back and say that 2 days after, the day after Kennedy's televised announcement, when the whole crisis became public, U Thant spent the entire day in deep consultation with other Third World leaders, with India, with Nehru in India, with Nkrumah in Ghana, with all the ambassadors in New York. And in a way, it's almost as a collective position, he went to the Security Council and he articulated what would become the basis of the settlement, that the missiles will be withdrawn in return for an American pledge not to invade the island. So that became the framework, and actually it was the UN that first articulated that framework. In addition to that, there was a secret deal between the Americans and the Russians for the Americans to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which they were intending to do at some point anyway, because they had become largely redundant. But even within a couple of weeks of the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis in late November, early December of 1962, the Kennedy White House wanted to make sure that they spun the story as one where President Kennedy was tough and the Russians backed down. And slowly, the image of a Burmese mediator with his Indian deputy and Egyptian deputy didn't fit into that picture. And so slowly, the role of the UN, and him in particular, was kind of written out of what happened. At the time, it wasn't written out. It was on, if you go back to the New York Times, then it was on the headline. His name was on the headline of the New York Times almost every day over those couple of weeks. It was a subsequent, almost airbrushing out of history that happened.
The lady in the second row, in white.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and that was a lovely session. The question is for both of you being a grandchild of a huge personality at a very formative and definitive time of that particular country or the world. At what point in your life you decided to write about your grandfather, and what from their life do you extrapolate into your world today and the things that are happening around?
What was the second part?
What do you extrapolate from their lives and how do you apply it in daily life?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a short answer to the question. I never thought, I mentioned before, I never thought of writing this book. I was actually going to write a book 4 years ago when I landed back in Cambridge. I was going to write a book about the East India Company in Burma in the early 19th century, so something completely different. And I was already researching that book in the British Library. But it was because this archive had been digitized that I started to see it and I started to look at it. And I realized from that the story that it seemed to tell was very different from what I knew at that time about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about Vietnam, about the Six-Day War. So that began the journey for me of writing the book. And in some ways, I think it's a timely kind of look back at a very different UN at a time when the UN right now is in deep crisis. And I think in many different ways we have to think about what the future can be. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I mean, mine is also fairly short. I also had no idea I was going to write this book. I was a history student. I was set to become a think tank foreign policy analyst. I was bored. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I found that VP Menon was my great grandfather. Nothing had been written about him. I Googled a lot. He left nothing behind two very dry but very seminal books on the transfer of power and the integration of the Indian states. And I really just wanted to figure out who this man was, how he'd got to where he was, and what else had he done apart from being Secretary of the Ministry of States and integrating 565 princely states, as if that is one's average Tuesday, but yes. It was just wanting to know more about my family and sort of wanting to discover what they did for the country, really speaking. We have a gentleman there in the brown jacket.
Thank you. I read your book on Burmese history, actually, and I was just wondering what the events, I guess, in the 50s and 60s, what in Burma itself, what that effect had on U Thant, actually, because things were also momentously changing, right, in Burma. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, he was obviously very influenced by what was happening in Burma. He was part of the Burmese government in the 1950s. He was an anti-communist. He was part of the government that was fighting a communist insurgency. And I think that was part of the reason that the Americans in 1961 thought he might be a useful ally at the UN. The Burmese government that he had worked for was overthrown in 1962 in a military coup, and he kept fairly good, sort of cordial relations with that military government in the beginning. But by the late 60s, they were quite estranged. The Burmese military dictator at the time, I think, didn't trust him, thought that he might be scheming behind his back, which he wasn't, to try to overthrow him. And so by 1970, what's interesting is that the Burmese government wouldn't even renew his Burmese passport. And so he was literally almost not a man without a country, but he was almost literally, this man on the 38th floor with no real power, dealing with all these issues from Biafra to Bangladesh to Vietnam to the Middle East, with nothing but a degree of popular support and his own moral imagination and his willingness to take risks and intervene. So I think unlike many other Secretary Generals who could always fall back on their governments to some extent or have a home to go to afterwards, he didn't. And so I think that was very much, and I think he was also, I think this must have been a source of great sadness, but also stress for him, because I see in his archive hundreds of letters from Burmese friends, people he knew, people he had worked for, who wrote to him asking for help, asking for a job somewhere, asking for help for their kids to get, and in very few cases could he actually help as UN Secretary General. But I think that must have also been a constant source of stress. I should also say that, he was someone who, by the end, I think had internalized a lot of these challenges, and he collapsed several times in his office from, I think, stress-related ailments. He was only 61, 62 when he retired, so not really an old person. But over that 10 years that he was UN Secretary General, working 6 days a week, he'd only taken 10 days holiday over 10 years as well. So I think he had taken on a lot by the time that he had retired in 1971.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we're all out of questions, but Thant Myint-U will be signing books in a location which will be notified to you. But thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you.